Afternoon, everyone. I am Ludivine Petetin, and I'm a professor of law at Cardiff University, and I'm a member of the CITP. Welcome to this webinar on the reflections that we can have on the UK-EU summit and the deal that we now have between the UK and the EU. Today, we have 4 panelists who are joining us. We have first Peter Foster, World Trade Editor at the Financial Times. Then we will have Emily Lydgate, who is Professor of Environmental Law and the Deputy Director at CITP and UKTPO at the University of Sussex. Followed by David Henig, Director of the UK Trade Policy Project. And our last speaker will be William Bain, Head of Trade Policy at the British Chambers of Commerce. So each speaker will have about 5 minutes to give us an introduction about thoughts on their respective areas of expertise in relation to the deal. So Peter, if you wouldn't mind starting, that would be lovely.
Thanks very much, Ludivine. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for having us. I'll start this discussion kind of quite broad, and I'll let my Wonkarati friends here get into some of the weeds. And then we can come back on it. You know, what do we make of this deal? I think we have to start by framing it the way the government framed it, which was no single market, no customs union. You know, those red lines just put quite strong, circumscribed quite strongly what could be achieved. And so by the government's calculation, 0.3% uplift of GDP by 2040 in 15 years. That's not a huge amount, right? Remember, Brexit's going to cost us 4% of GDP. So we're talking fractions, shaving fractions off the overall damage caused by Brexit. So what did we achieve within that small envelope? Well, I'm going to start actually with the security and defence partnership. There is a trade element to that, which would be that we would get access to the 150 billion EU loan facility, SAFE, for rearmament. Some of the value of that is overstated. Remember, this is just access to loans at slightly better rates. We'll have to pay to play, subject to another negotiation. But nonetheless, the principle that the UK as a third country can be integrated into European rearmament projects, I think, is important. The second slightly underplayed piece of the defence and security partnership is that it replumbs some of the diplomatic plumbing that was ruptured at Brexit. Remember, when the Brexit negotiations were going on, a lot of people in Europe sort of feared that the UK would be the kind of elephant in the room all the time. And as it turned out, we kind of left the room. We disappeared, partly under the injunction from Boris Johnson and David Frost in those very hostile days. But actually, the UK, when you talk to European officials and diplomats, is amazingly kind of out of sight and out of mind. And I think this piece of architecture, so twice yearly meetings between the Foreign Secretary and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, personnel exchanges potentially, getting the UK on some of the kind of security committees and data sharing committees, that is not entirely insignificant. While everyone jumps on it's only 0.3% of GDP, nonetheless, I think that architectural reconnection has the potential to be important, as in that vein does the chance for us to sit on some of the regulatory committees on the 2 other files that matter, so SPS and the veterinary agreement, and the energy file, the relinking of our energy markets. Again, we don't have a vote, but I think it's a start, and it will put the UK back in the room in a way that we weren't in the room over the last 4 or 5 years, as we frankly suffered our Brexit exile. And this deal brings that exile to an end. So on the substance of the 2 other kind of main files, which I think are worth talking about, SPS and the energy market linkage, I think start with energy market linkage. There was something of a coup here. Up to now, the Commission has really taken a no cherry-picking approach, even though the loose volume coupling system that was set up after Brexit, it's never worked, it's never been implemented, it's never going to work. The EU system for valuing the carbon content of UK electrons is way off beam. It doesn't value them correctly. But hitherto, when industry has complained about this and said that if we want this joint investment in the North Sea to create all this green electricity that is going to mean actually that the EU makes its green transition more quickly than it otherwise would, is going to burn less carbon, is going to have lower prices for the consumers. The Commission position to date has been, we don't care, we've got our CBAM, we've got our ETS, you're outside the energy market. And I think that very hard position has softened significantly when you read these documents, and that is an important step forward. It should also be said, the area of the most obvious common interest between the EU and the UK. And we've seen, for example, with the movement on European on electric vehicle rules of origin back at the back end of last year, that the Commission will move where it is really self-evidently in their interest. But on that energy file, I think that's important. 800 million, I think, is the estimate of the cost it would be for us to be filling out CBAM reports, etc. Assuming we get this linkage and the time frame is to be determined, the CBAM issue is going to go away, at least GB EU. It remains to be seen whether the two schemes converge. There are elements of the UK scheme that are different, but nonetheless, I think a quite important signal there in that. And then on the SBS deal, again, we wait and see. The briefing around the place from the British side to supermarkets and others is that it could all be done by Christmas. That seems rather optimistic to me. Had a rather sort of frosty comment from a European official, said, well, that'll be fine as long as the UK agrees to everything that they're asked after them. And so, that remains to be seen. Nonetheless, I think, Jundu Aston says 20+% uplift in UK exports on food and agri products, so that's a big win. And then very lastly, what's not in it? Well, all the stuff that is circumscribed by their red lines. Nothing on this musicians deal, which is a bit embarrassing because that's a manifesto commitment. Nothing on conformity assessment. Remember Mr. Barnier saying you will not be a certification hub off the coast of Europe. Well, that still stands. Vague commitments on professional qualifications. The mobility piece, again, left very vague. And the last thing I will say is, although the SPS deal was delinked from fish because we gave them 12-year access to our fishing water, we will have to wait and see whether, if the UK drags its feet on mobility, the Commission finds ways to drag its feet on the SPS deal. And, William and others will have a clearer idea of me what the risk of that happening is. But I do think that remains a sticking point going down the line, particularly when you saw just quite how tricky the negotiation got at the end of the day. And with the security partnership there, we've seen with the French, they're very able to silo the security piece and be quite tricky on the trade stuff. So I'll stop there. That's my whistle-stop tour of the deal.
Thank you very much, Peter, for such insightful comments. Emily?
So negotiations always have a political level and a technical level. And I think what's really notable as an achievement is that there has been the political will to agree what is basically a framework for future negotiations. And then the next thing is maintaining the political will to clear the obstacles to basically overcome any resistance to resolving the tricky details, more or less. And I think nowhere is this tension more evident than in the area of SPS. So I'll try to live up to my Wonkarati title and focus a little bit more on that area because I think there's still a lot that needs to be resolved there. So, on the one hand, the Labour government has already relitigated with the public, for EU-UK cooperation. The political victory is that they've said, okay, we're basically going to be a rule taker. And we're going to align really ambitious, deep alignment with EU regulations. We recognize there'll be a role for the Court of Justice. I mean, this is all, cue hysterical headlines and backlash, but this was an act of, political courage and political will for Labour to do this. But now there's a lot of unanswered questions about how this will work. both on a kind of a treaty level and also with the UK's domestic governance. So if we go back, to the beginning, food law is an area, like many other areas, where the UK really decided to prioritize full regulatory autonomy to an almost comical degree, right? So the UK has more ambition on regulatory mutual recognition, regulatory alignment in its FTAs with Australia and New Zealand than the TCA SPS chapter does. So, but in the area of food law, and SPS is, part of that, this decision had costs that were quite apparent, including, the fact that agri-food exports from the UK to the EU were one of the most affected sectors, and there's been various studies. They usually show up alongside textiles as one of the areas that has really suffered, and also, of course, intra-UK trade barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland emerged. So that was a domestic problem, and there's been various attempts to try to, fix things around the edges. But I think what we're seeing here is that Labour, a real shift in priorities, where Labour is saying, you know what, regulatory sovereignty is not an end in itself. We also need to think about other objectives and how this, fits in with those. So the SPS agreement, what an SPS agreement basically does is, in the area of human, animal, or plant life or health regulation, two countries agree to harmonize or mutually recognize each other's regulation. And in these areas, you reduce or eliminate border checks. And what this commitment does is to say that more or less there's going to be a broad or deep SPS agreement between the UK and the EU. The sectoral scope is quite large. So it's a very ambitious statement. But then the next questions that arise is, what has to happen for this to happen? And it's not just about, basically changing UK regulations, so the kind of formal legislative divergence aspect of it. To some extent, the UK is going to have to rehitch its regulatory processes to the EU. So we have, for example, questions about, the role of EU agencies, the European Food Safety Authority. There's the enforcement angle. And of course, if the UK is essentially policing the EU's external border for food regulations, the EU might want the UK to reform some of its border procedures. The role of the Court of Justice has already been stipulated, and this isn't going to be, it's often compared to the Swiss agreement, but it's not the Swiss agreement. There's no way that it can be, because there will be inevitably a line drawn between things that are subject to checks and things that aren't. So where do you draw that line? How do you decide what is and isn't? In the UK, food law is devolved. So there's also a question about how devolved governments fit into this. And I think it's important to, to specify that democratic oversight of food governance and the role of Parliament and the role of devolved nations is something that can still be included, even if you're a rule taker. So, and there's lots of different models of how you can do regulatory alignment. So these, I think, are some of the questions that the UK, there's the external level of the treaty, and then there's the internal level of how this domestic governance is going to take place. So these will be the interesting areas to watch. I would be surprised if this gets wrapped up in 6 months.
So another similarity with Peter, not before Christmas. Thank you very much, Emily, for those comments. Our next speaker is David.
Thank you, Ludivine. Let me make 5 points. First of all, around symbolism. There is clearly just a huge positive symbolism here from moving on from Brexit. This is identifiably the start of a different relationship. We are now talking about, openly about alignment. We're talking about ECJ. We're talking about mobility issues. The EU is watering down some of its red lines on single market participation around energy, as Peter said. That is, central to, one of the easiest things, central to the growth mission on both sides, but it's still significant. So a hugely important symbolic moment. And yet underneath that symbolic moment, I think that there's probably been less of a shift than is obvious on both sides. You've still got an EU negotiating machinery that is all about getting the best possible deals and will, as we can see, go right down to the wire in changing the wording of statements, in making fish 12 years rather than I don't know what was on offer before. That doesn't look like much of a change. I'm not sure that the EU and strategic partnership is quite a phrase that they really understand. But at the same time, you still have a UK that never really put its case forward in Brussels as to kind of what it exactly wanted, that really let the Commission do most of the driving here. This was very much driven from the top of the Commission, from Team von der Leyen. And so as we go into the negotiations to basically firm up the outline of what's been agreed, I'm not sure we're actually on that firmer ground for doing so. I'd be amazed if we had an SPS deal in 6 months. We might have a Commission mandate for it in 6 months. These things take time. I just think that there's still a lot of naivety in the system. I think the second thing I'd say, and now picking up on energy, is that really intense stakeholder activity has been shown to make a difference. The energy lobby got together, both sides, both UK and EU companies, and just drove home the message repeatedly to their politicians on both sides. We need energy. This is all part of EU's energy security. This is part of EU's growth agenda. North Sea wind, which obviously sits between UK and EU, it simply requires this energy linkage. And I think they would admit that what came out of the summit was at the most optimistic end of their expectation. So that just shows for other things what is actually now possible. So those red lines, particularly on the EU side, while they may be a bit thinner, if a really strong case is made. The EU has said that some of the issues that weren't on the table, it was partly because they didn't want to go too far down the Swiss line. So I think that there's a slow recognition within the EU system that's probably the direction of travel, but it will take a concerted effort over a period to deliver that. Third point on what I think was disappointing about this is there are a couple of areas that are missing. One, there's not really anything on the whole industrial side. So we're removing all the barriers potentially on food and drink. We're not doing very much on mutual recognition of conformity assessment, pan-Euromed on rules of origin. There's a large amount of trade there. It's not really a strict red line for the Commission, though they can make different arguments about it. It was just something that at this stage was probably seen as being too much. You can't put too much into what is probably still a fragile reset, which I think is reasonable enough. But what happens to those issues? And the second part of that is that there's really there's a weakness in the institutional architecture. We have the annual summits now. There's a fair bit on the security and defence side, but the deeper regulatory dialogue, which you would hope to see, isn't really there. There's a brief reference to it. Something could happen there, but it feels like, and I've seen too many negotiations where the politicians agree things, then they let the negotiators onto it, and then get surprised in a year or two's time when not much has happened, because it does need a regular political steer, and I worry that not enough has been put in that place. Fourth thing around Northern Ireland, in general, good for Northern Ireland. If we can remove the barriers to UK-EU trade on SPS, that actually reduces quite a lot of the barriers from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Really positive, and I think shows that Northern Ireland remains quite strong in mind in Brussels. So ETS also dramatically simplifies life in Northern Ireland. They were not looking forward to working out how ETS impacts them. Slight caveat. It's still not clear how those agreements are going to be written, how much the SPS agreement between the UK and the EU actually supplements or replaces the Windsor framework. We could yet get some interesting challenges around that. Final point, TCA review. not mentioned at all. And now many people, including myself, had suggested this is probably not going to be the opportunity for a great renegotiation. But equally, it has no particularly set form. But just to be ignored doesn't suggest that anybody was thinking this is going to be some opportunity to add items to the agenda. I think that's probably a mistake. I think there is a case to be made for saying, given this has no set form, why don't we let stakeholders actually submit their comments, maybe through the domestic advisory groups, and actually give a list to both sides and say, here are the things that we think could still be worked on. I'll leave that thought kind of hanging there as a potential for a future agenda. I think that's about my 5 minutes up.
Thank you very much, David, for such insightful reflections. Our last speaker is William.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. In terms of the advantages, I think the first is that political leadership matters. That hand on the tiller really counts, and that has been missing for 5 years. We now will have a process of annual summits. That in itself will be very interesting for stakeholders to observe and be able to try and influence. It will create an impetus, as we get towards each year's summit in terms of what can be achieved, what are the deliverables, what are the new focuses for negotiation in that coming 12 months. So the fact of that process itself is, I think, highly welcome, and something which business and other stakeholders, we will be seeking to influence as much as we can in a beneficial way. I think there is more trust in the relationship, but it is still a highly transactional relationship. There is an enormous difference from being a few feet outside the perimeter and being a few feet inside the perimeter. We've seen that in the way that the discussions went. I think it was important, really important, that we had very clear principles in terms of the way that the SPS agreements and the ETS linkage agreements were going to be conducted, and that dynamic alignment and ECJ jurisdiction were there, and that these were not issues to be haggled over in the discussion themselves. I think the UK is going to have a whole range of regulatory relationships with the EU going forward. That's a point that we need to consider too. There will be dynamic alignment in some areas. In some areas, it's adequacy in terms of data. In some areas, mutual recognition. In some areas, unilateral alignment, as we see with CE marking. And then in some sectors of the economy, AI and other services areas, we may not have much of a commonality in regulation at all. There may be more divergence in those areas between the two. So that's going to be quite a complex regulatory framework, relational framework for business and other stakeholders to have to adjust to. What's the positives from this? Well, assuming that the agreement is translated into a operable legal text on SPS, and assuming that it's going to cover 99.5% of food and plant products, apart from those which have to be monitored because of very, very high risk and danger, it means sweeping away the export health certificates, £200 a throw, thousands of pounds for a single truck in many cases. Sweeping away, sadly, the border control posts. Perhaps they can be repurposed for some other usage in the coming years. But again, the need for trucks and lorries to go through those, gone. Much of the delays down to SPS, gone as well. So those are real positives, real cost savings, both for UK exporters in Great Britain into the EU and also for EU exporters into GB as well. So it should strip cost out of the system. It will be very beneficial. But look, there were some things which, were not achieved. I mean, the BCC achieved 5 out of its 7 key objectives for the summit. But some things which, clearly are still on the table, which will need to be recampaigned for ahead of future summits. So things like safety and security certificates, where there's a clear precedent with the EU having done a deal with Switzerland to remove those. That's an area we can see further progress on in the future. The PEM Convention, the BCC is a very firm and evidence-based position on PEM. We'll see whether other stakeholders develop that same position and are able to amplify that case to both government and to the European Commission. The other aspect to all of this, and I think it was touched upon by Emily, is, as Michel Barnier said once, the single market is not just about the regulations, it's about the ecosystem. And it is highly likely that the UK will become an observer in terms of EFSA. And it's not just the primary regulations the UK will need to align to, but the secondary and often tertiary decision-making from some of these regulatory bodies in the food space. There will also need to be a very strong alignment mechanism, which is legislated for at Westminster. So primary legislation is going to be needed to bring the full parameters of an SPS deal into force. We can expect this will be very controversial at Westminster. It won't happen overnight. So I would share the analysis that whilst we would want to get an SPS deal up and running and in place, operational as soon as possible, there's quite a few hurdles to get over before we get there, although the hope of progress is good. Some other issues I think have still got to be resolved, although we do have a very firm steer that there will be ETS linkage, good for investment, good for development of the North Sea. The electricity cooperation, very promising as well. But is there going to be full alignment of the two CBAMs required? Is that going to be part of the thing that has to be negotiated to get this particular deal over the line? And then I think also the role of business, it's having that evidence-based, practically focused policy making that business and other stakeholders have been really good at, which has helped shift the envelope. And we hope that we will be able to help contribute to that in the coming years and beyond. And the role of the DAG and its subcommittees is, I think, very important in bringing this consensus together as well. Other things I think we'd like to develop in the future, we need to have a critical minerals agreement. It's a little bit of an omission that the UK has supply chain and critical minerals agreements with some of its key partners, but not with the European Union. We should look to put that right in the future. In Northern Ireland, I think this is generally very positive, but there could be some pinch points. The SPS deal will be GB only. We know that for certain. And so watch negotiations on things like gene editing. And there is the push factor of, economic growth in the UK wanting to retain those advantages it's had from divergence in this area since 2021, but also the Windsor framework factors in the other hand, so pulling things and saying, watch, we don't want to see divergence within the United Kingdom. Firms will not want to see any additional labeling requirements. So gene editing is going to be an issue to watch, I think, in the SPS negotiation, particularly around Northern Ireland. Yes, there will still be a technical review of the TCA. Important that that's still there. It's a treaty requirement. But this new process gives a political impetus, the ability to have annual discussions, to be able to more regularly influence our trading and wider defence and other relationships. And for that reason, it's a very welcome development.
Thank you very much, William, for bringing this, the business side to the panel. So thank you very much. We have had a few questions in the Q&A. So thank you very much for submitting your questions. If you have more, please do not hesitate. I think just a few themes that I can see arising from the questions that we have. How do you see, and this is to all our panelists, how do you see the relationship evolve through, the next few months, the next few years? So William talked about, the political impetus, and I think David as well talked about that. How do you think things are going to progress in terms of, conformity assessment, which some of you have mentioned, in terms of working on more sustainable mechanisms in terms of deforestation, welfare, animal welfare, environmental protection? How do you see the relationship going? Can we expect easier trade between us and the EU? So that would be my first part of the question. And the second part of what I wanted to ask is, how do you see this fitting with other agreements that the UK has signed? So CPTPP, for example, but the most recent ones, which we haven't seen very much, very many details, but, with the US, with India, how do you think that this is going to, to develop as well?
One of the issues with this deal is that imagine another world where you'd had a Labour government that was less politically constrained than this one, that had realised that it was always going to have to do a deal on fish and had done it quickly, that had accepted that actually a youth mobility deal was a gateway to deeper professional mobility, which a lot of member states, Sweden, Germany, Spain, wanted, and had been more ambitious from the outset. It would have created a very different conversation. The fact that that hasn't happened, that right from the get-go, right from the election campaign, the Labour government decided it couldn't afford politically. And if you look at the way it rolled the pitch for this deal, it doesn't give you a huge amount of confidence that we would go much deeper than we already have. If you want to take an optimistic view, you could argue, well, once you've done alignment on SPS, then why not do it on other sectors? Once you've got through that hurdle, then why not? I think there's two answers to that. One is, as you get closer to election, these things get harder, and we've seen from the reaction on the right wing to this deal, it wouldn't matter what you did, you'd be howled down for betrayal and all the rest of it. And I think the challenge that may well come subsequent to that is that if the Labour government continues to struggle domestically, politically, then you have this looming question about the extent to which the next British government, if it's not Keir Starmer or Keir Starmer's successor Labour government, is going to try and unravel the stuff that's being done now. Nigel Farage, who knows, maybe the head of a coalition government of the United Kingdom in 4 years' time is out there saying he is going to unravel it. Now, you can have your own views as to whether or not that's a realistic prospect, but in a first past the post system, if reform continued to rise in the polls, then the spectre of reform or some kind of conservative populist government, is going to hang over the process. And that's why I think actually it's going to be difficult to get to the kind of places that would deepen cooperation. And then, of course, lastly, alignment doesn't give you access, the old saw. So even to William's point about industrial alignment, there are sectors of the UK economy, chemicals, for example, that don't want alignment if UK is going to be outside the single market and therefore not part of EU reach, going to have its own only representative, not have letters of access to the data files in Helsinki. That's the last thing they want. And so alignment isn't, a simple sell to the UK business side.
I think in terms of how Monday went and, that agreements were reached and the optics were very good and the discussions have been fine. I think we would see Monday's agreements as being a floor, but not a ceiling. There is still a lot that can be added in to what was in the Common Understandings document to ease trade, make it less costly, less burdensome, even within the contours of the red lines of both the UK government and the European Union. So I think the challenge is going to be to see everything that was agreed implemented in very timorously, but also to look then at how we can expand that gap. And BCC and many other organizations have proposals which can fill that. Some are a bit more higher hanging fruit than Monday's, but that's going to be the challenge, is to build that case, the evidence base, the alliance of interests with business and other stakeholders in the European Union, and to present this as further win-wins. I think that's going to be our work over the next few years. I think in terms of the relationship, if not in its entire substance, I think it's now evolving into Swiss EU in terms of style. We are going to have continuous negotiations, not just over the terms of the TCA and some of the trade barriers from that, but also as regulation evolves in both jurisdictions. CBAM wasn't an issue 5 years ago. It has become a massive issue now. EU deforestation regulation, not an issue 5 years ago, massive issue now. You look at the forthcoming reforms in the EU of the de minimis rule in terms of small packages, the reform of the Union Customs Code. So we're going to be negotiating these points of regulatory divergence and what they mean for trade on a permanent basis. And I think Monday is the beginning of putting together an architecture and an acknowledgement that we may not have sort of Swiss-style agreements, but we have a Swiss-style negotiation. The other technical issue I think will be really important in these negotiations coming up is whether both sides view each of the agreements to be adopted as self-contained measures, or are we into, with the panoply of them, the 4 or 5 to be negotiated, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So will they all be seen as a package dependent on each of them being done, or will they be self-contained? That's a very important thing. And then also the architecture. Are these going to be simply agreements bolted into the TCA, or will some of them become part of the TCA? Should we be looking to amend the TCA to make it more permanent arrangement? And there could be attractions for the European Union in terms of dealing with the point that Peter's raised about, the changing politics here in the UK in having these as part of the TCA itself. So that will be something to watch in terms of the conduct of these discussions and negotiations in coming months. In terms of how they fit in with other trade agreements, of course, New Zealand has had an equivalence arrangement on SPS with the EU for quite a few years. That's not been seen to be contrary to CPTPP. In terms of India and the US, I think the negotiations between the UK government and them were crafted in the knowledge of where the UK government wanted to end up. And it's interesting, it has not been a condition of this heads of agreement deal with the US that there is, in a sense, a departure from the precautionary principle on SPS from the UK. So I think we can have confidence that it's not going to imperil these current trade deals, some of which have still got to be implemented in full. And it will fit within the UK's obligations in terms of CPTPP as well.
I mean, obviously, May has been a big month for UK trade policy with their trifecta or triumvirate or whatever you want to call it, with the UK-US, UK-India, UK-EU, and all of them are basically agreements to talk further. We're in Washington, D.C. right now. So just on the UK-US thing, I think one thing that that hasn't fully perhaps been appreciated is the fact that the degree to which the US seems to have changed its positioning on this. So we did this panel event yesterday, and one of the former Trump 1 officials was reminding us that the reason that the UK wasn't able to negotiate with the US to have steel and aluminium tariffs removed during the first Section 232, we've been here before, right? But the reason they weren't able to do that was because essentially the Trump administration was concerned about the UK's wider regulatory package, in particular SPS. So in this next phase agreement, basically, we're having to revisit this issue, and we have in that agreement this promise that if the UK aligns with US requirements on security of supply chains, which include things like no Chinese ownership, then those tariffs will be removed. So it seems like that's just a national security issue now, and it's not being seen in the kind of the ecosystem approach of, we want to pull you away from the EU's regulatory model. So I think that's a big victory actually for the UK. However, I do also think it's, none of these things are set in stone. And I do wonder about the sequencing. So if the UK-EU agreement had come first, how would that have, created political obstacles to the UK-US agreement? I think is a really interesting question. And there could be, future either or, right now the UK, I think, is doing quite a good job of, being in a polygamous relationship with the, it's typical mid-Atlantic thing with the US and the EU cooperating with both. But the UK seems to be signaling, and I think this was another takeaway from speaking to people here on both sides in DC, is that the UK is signaling pretty strongly that it's going to go with the US on kind of its requirements on China, Chinese investment screening and export controls and those kinds of things. So I think there's some really important questions about the scope of those commitments. I think it's still not fully resolved that SPS will be off the table. I think there's questions about digital and data sharing and what's going to happen there. So I think there could still be a kind of some tensions in that relationship.
Being based in Wales, I wonder, because Emily touched upon that a little bit, how we are, or how do you think the devolved nations are going to react? Obviously, there is a slightly different side for Northern Ireland, but how do you think that this is going to be received mostly in Scotland and Wales, this new agreement? Although obviously for agriculture in Scottish and Welsh agriculture, it would be positive overall. We also have had a few, so that was my question, very interested in what you all have to say. We have had a question in terms, some technical questions actually, in relation to the SPS agreement and the possible exceptions to dynamic alignment. Could you give examples, if any of you could think about that? And then we have had someone working at a BCP who is wondering how quickly can we see things change. And William mentioned that, BCP we'll have less work to do. So how quickly can we see those changes? I think that would be very, very positive to know. And then another technical one, dare I say, on not for EU labeling on fisheries products and whether that's going to remain. But obviously not that I'm a panelist, but from what you said, it's not going to take place it's not going to change very quickly over the next 6 months. So, there is some time to adjust and adapt for all interested.
I was quite struck by what William just said about having a regulatory diversity towards the EU, and the fact that we're absolutely not set up for this in the UK system. We don't have any more an EU scrutiny committee, and one can argue how, whether that towards its end was more about one individual showboating compared to, as what it should have done. But we don't have one. Well, it's not entirely clear how the devolves will kind of play into this, given that they technically have policy responsibility in some of these areas. It's not really clear how the negotiations are going to run for all of that. So we are significantly way out process on the UK side. Now, I've been talking for quite a while about the fact that the UK's not really been set up very well for a consultation around trade agreements in general, but I think this is really coming to a point here with regards to the EU. how long can you essentially continue to treat negotiations as entirely secret and all just in the matter of government, when from here on in we're going to be implementing primary, secondary, tertiary regulation, as William said, coming from the EU? It seems to me we don't have a tenable situation. We are going to have to do something about that. Things have got to be changed. Will be interesting to see how the UK government comes forward or not with any of that, or how stakeholders start telling them they have to come forward with this. Just on the question of timescales and border control posts implementation, I think what we need to think about is this one is the one illustration. We are talking about some good food arrives in at a UK port and is onward shipped straight away, let's say, to France. Basically, the question is going to be, how long does it take the EU to trust the UK checks are sufficient on that product that they will remove all checks in return? The answer when it came to Switzerland originally was nearly 10 years from the start of negotiations until all checks were removed. Maybe it can be done quicker, but this isn't primarily about the technical negotiation. There are problems there. Emily raised lots of those. This is a question of trust at the first instance. And if you look at how the talks have gone so far, you would suggest that trust is still not really there between the UK and the EU. So a lot still has to be done. So I think I'm afraid that's a sort of throwing cold water over the whole thing kind of answer. But there's a huge amount to do here. And UK government triumphalism, I'm afraid, I was sort of inwardly groaning on that, of going, it's an okay deal. There's a lot to do. Please don't start selling this as the greatest thing that'll transform everybody's lives from next week or whatever. This is going to be a long play.
Thank you. And on the topic of trust, you made me think we take it, that it's easily done in the EU, but it's also very difficult for member states within the EU to trust each other, because even mutual recognition within the single market is difficult. So that's just an aside. Peter, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, David's point about trust, we didn't have very high levels of trust or when we were a member state, remember, right? There were all sorts of commission investigations about what we'd done with, tax on shoes and all the rest of it. And I think, there's a serious point there. I'm going to slightly disagree with David on the devolved stuff. I take his point about architecture, and obviously London becomes, the new Brussels to Edinburgh and Cardiff, effectively, right? Now we've repatriated those responsibilities. And we saw the Sewell Convention breaking down under Johnson and Frost, right? We saw the devolved parliaments refusing to ratify Brexit legislation, and we saw, Westminster riding roughshod over devolved competences, not just in SPS, but also in education, other areas when it was dishing out what became the Shared Prosperity Fund, etc. I do think this deal, both because the Labour government is more alive to the devolved administrations, but this deal fundamentally moves the devolved administrations in the direction they want to go. So Angus Robertson, angry that they weren't consulted during the negotiation, but fundamentally this is good for Scottish salmon exporters, etc. And churlish as the Scottish National Party might be, fundamentally it's doing something that they've asked for a long, right from the get-go, which is it moves us back to Brussels. In a Welsh context, this will be good for Holyhead, good for make life easier for Welsh exports, etc. So I sort of think in the round, the architectural institutional point aside, this makes things easier in a devolved setting, not harder.
I would agree with Peter. One of the things that happened after Brexit was again, you go back to this issue about ecosystems. So it became clear that, the hidden wiring had to go somewhere. And so the UK government brought in a piece of legislation, the UK Internal Market Act, which has been quite controversial. I mean, the Scottish government's very much opposed to it. And that does at least create an architecture to try and discuss and deliberate and decide upon some of these issues, So, in Scotland, gene editing might still be an issue where the Scottish government is very much against. So that architecture will be tested and will be needed more than ever in order to deal with this. But as Peter says, broadly in Cardiff and in Edinburgh, moving SPS to a system where there is alignment will be seen to be a good move and good for agri-food industries in both devolved nations.
I just want to say I've learned not to be so optimistic on UK-EU matters. You may, Peter and William, you may both be right, but if the optimistic view ends up being the right one, well, there's always a first in Brexit matters.
Yes, I think that would be a good note to to end on. But I would say that on the devolved, it's kind of a two-level issue, isn't it? The role of the devolves, because I guess I could use my same framework that I started with, which is the political level and the technical level thing. And trust is important here as well, right? So if it's a lot easier to have a trust-based approach where you just kind of don't have to formalize stuff very much, if you have everyone's in the Labour Party and everyone's kind of going for the same objectives. And so the issue that I always, someone who grew up in the US where things tend to be much more codified legally, I'm always interested in the very informal approach to to some of these structures that sometimes happens in the UK. And I think that's going to be a really interesting aspect of the SPS, whatever's worked out on SPS, because on a good example that of this dual dynamic is the product regulation and metrology bill, which is about basically the UK saying, well, we're going to dynamically align on, on some technical, environmental product regulation with the EU, but they don't really, it's not very specific about which regulation or how do you decide. And it's all done by, basically delegated legislation. So ministers just decide, do the devolved nations have a role in this? How is this going to work? None of that is really specified. So it's all very, very executive led and central UK government led. And you could easily see that kind of approach going, the central UK government trying to adopt that kind of approach to an SPS agreement, the domestic governance of that kind of dynamic alignment decision. And even though politically that might be, aligned with devolved nations' interest, I think it still is an interesting question about how much you should codify or formalize that devolved nations have a role in this, that we, here's our mandate, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're not going to do, here's what the process is.
If I can just scoop up a couple of other things, not for EU labelling, that should be gone eventually. Questions like labelling are going to be really interesting anyway. Do they fall within the scope of an SPS agreement or not? Exactly what falls in the scope, that will turn out to be really interesting. Are there, what kind of issues are already coming up? There will be issues around things like, use of chemicals, around restrictions that the EU put in place that sometimes will have an unfortunate impact on the UK. I've already been lobbied in a case around oats, which may be an issue. So there will be all manner of these sort of small issues around on SPS. Some of the same applies on ETS as well, and all of which adds up to. And there were a few questions around on is this the list of issues, the ones that will definitely be worked on? Could there be new issues? The answer is this is the list of issues, I think, until it isn't, until things come up where for whatever reason these ones disappear, other ones appear. I don't think I think that's in the nature now of, if we are moving to something more Swiss style, the nature is the agenda is fixed until the point it isn't, for whatever reason. We're a lot more in flux now. In reality, that's been happening the last 3 or 4 years anyway. There's just too much at stake in this relationship. There are too many topics covered for it to be entirely a rigid process.
And we should say a little more about Northern Ireland. I mean, I spent 2 great days in sunny Belfast last Monday and Tuesday with meetings in Stormont and speaking with Northern Ireland businesses. And, what was very clear, as well as this agenda and what the implications would be for Northern Ireland in making the movement of food products easier across the Irish Sea, is also the emerging regulatory challenges. So will the EU deforestation regulation apply under the Windsor framework? Companies telling me last week, rubber tires, cardboard boxes in which goods are shipped into the European Union, all potentially in scope. Where does the test is going to be on issues like this of the UK-EU relationship? Can we have a mature discussion and resolve these issues with the kind of approaches that we've seen from the agreements that this week? And that's what we mean about this ongoing negotiation.
And the importance of the political will, which has, really come really strong. And we had a question in terms of, would it be beneficial to combine the TCA technical review next year with the political summit, so that we reduce even more the frictions between the two parties? Would that be something that you see positive overall?
Well, I'll throw in my few pennies worth that I think that I suspect that by next year's summit there will already be plenty of issues that will have been arisen during the actual technical negotiations on what we have. I think that the question of whether the TCA review is added into the summit is, as always with such things, is going to be intensely political. If enough of a case is made by enough stakeholders, that should be the case. It will be the case. If it isn't, the TCA review could easily just fall by the wayside and never be mentioned again. And I actually genuinely think that it is as unclear as that. As one savvy Whitehall operator told me that they half expected the TCA review to consist of a European Commission official passing them a piece of paper to say, we have agreed that we've had a review, please sign here.
That would make a lot of lawyers unhappy, dare I say.
I was just going to say very quickly, I think the review could inform the run-up to summits, but I feel now that you have sort of the UK Prime Minister, the heads of two of the EU institutions involved, that in time, this process of annual summits may become the more predominant one of the two.
Yes, I think the TCA review has been superseded a bit by this. But I mean, I have never really understood why the Commission didn't seem so interested in doing much in the space of the TCA review. And I'm sure other people on this call understand that and could enlighten us.
Peter, do you have a final word? No,
other than I defer to all my panelists. I mean, the simple reason that, the sort of Stefan Feurings of this world didn't want to get into the TCA review was at that point, they didn't want to reopen the TCA. It was a way of enforcing that red line and avoiding, at least until there was sufficient political will, the kind of messy negotiation that my fellow panelists have so cleverly elucidated over the next few months and years. So, I think that red line has all kind of almost been broken by definition. I think it will be less important what's TCA review, what's just part of the kind of summitry and the ongoing relationship. I think William made a really interesting point about whether or not these vertical deals get bolted into the TCA or whether they stand free. Because I think if they are bolted into the TCA, that gives them more longevity over time.
Indeed. On those final words, thank you very much, Peter, Emily, David, and William, for such insightful comments. We all learned so much from you. Thank you very much to all our participants as well, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you all so much.